Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a speech all about spreading the Christian message across the globe. It's titled Gospel to All Nations, and it was delivered by someone from Nagaland, India, to a Korean audience. So strap in, it's going to be a fascinating ride.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is how the speech connects, like this really old biblical idea to our modern world. It's
Yeah.
all about reaching every single nation with the gospel.
It jumps right into this concept of the Great Commission, right? That command to evangelize. But I gotta say, the word choice really caught my attention. The speaker uses ethne.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Using the Greek word ethne instead of just like nations
Mm.
really broadens the scope. It's not just about geography, it's about reaching distinct people groups, each with their own culture and language.
Which makes this mission even more massive, right? We're talking about over 15,000 different groups worldwide. I mean, where do you even begin with something that big?
Well, and that's where the speech gets really interesting, because it ties this huge mission to the power of the Holy Spirit. Specifically, it brings up Acts 1.8, which is like a prophecy, not just a promise.
Okay, so remind me, what does Acts 1.8 actually say? My biblical memory is a bit fuzzy.
Sure, it says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." It's a two-part promise, right? You receive the Holy Spirit, which gives you the power to be effective witnesses, and that witness spreads further and further until it reaches, like, literally everywhere.
It's like saying, this mission is huge, but you're not in this alone. You've got this divine power backing you up.
Exactly. And from there, the speech goes on to highlight just how many people still haven't heard the gospel. We're talking 7 billion people on earth, over 6,400 unreached people groups, and over 2,000 of those are just in India.
Wow, those numbers really do put things in perspective. You really get a sense of how much work there is to be done. But then the speech takes this, interesting turn. It starts focusing on the role of Korea in all of this.
Yeah, I think that's where you see the speaker really tailoring the message to their audience. They start talking about Korea's unique set of strengths that could be super valuable to this global effort.
And it's not just about sending missionaries, right?
Right, it goes way beyond that. It's about Korea's power, but that power is like multi-dimensional. Spiritual power, for sure, through prayer and a strong Christian community. But also Korea's got technological power, economic resources, even cultural influence.
Yeah.
I mean, think about K-pop, Korean dramas, all that stuff is spread around the world.
Oh, that's a good point. It's like they're saying, hey, use every tool you've got, find a way to connect with people and create opportunities to share the gospel.
Exactly. And the speaker uses this really down-to-earth example to illustrate this idea. They talk about the skill of using chopsticks and call it a God-given power. I mean, it sounds a little funny at first, but it makes a really powerful point.
I love that. Even our everyday skills can be used for something bigger than ourselves. Makes me wonder, what are our own chopstick skills, right? What do we have that might seem ordinary, but could actually help us share the gospel?
It's a great question. And it leads us to another really interesting part of this speech, where they talk about the different ways people can be involved in this global effort. Because it's not just about those people we typically think of as missionaries.
Right. The speech breaks it down into 3 categories, if I remember correctly: stayed, scattered, and sent missionaries. And I gotta say, this really resonated with me.
Yeah, me too. I think it's such a brilliant way to, expand our whole understanding of what it means to be a missionary. You don't necessarily have to go overseas.
It's really empowering because it shows that everyone can be involved, regardless of your situation. So, why don't we break down these different types, starting with stayed missionaries?
So stayed missionaries are those who, they feel called to serve right where they are in their own communities.
So, like making a difference in your own backyard, kinda?
Exactly. It could be anything.
Yeah.
Volunteering at a soup kitchen, teaching Sunday school, just trying to live out your faith in your everyday life.
I like that. It's not about where you are, it's about your attitude, your heart for serving.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have scattered missionaries. These are people who, well, maybe they didn't plan on being missionaries, but their life kind of takes them to different places.
Oh, interesting. Like their job moves them to a new city, or they have family in another country.
Right. And they find themselves in these situations where they can build bridges with people from different cultures.
Yeah.
The speech actually gives the example of Korean missionaries who go to India and start businesses or enroll in universities just as a way to stay there and minister.
Wow, that's pretty creative. But I guess it doesn't have to be that dramatic. It could be someone who moves to a new city for work, and ends up in a really diverse neighborhood. They weren't sent there to be a missionary, but they still have this opportunity, right, to connect with people and share their faith.
Exactly. It's like God is working through these everyday situations to, open doors for the gospel. It makes you think, right, maybe even our own moves or career changes are part of a bigger story.
It really does. And then, of course, there are the sent missionaries, the ones who feel called to a specific place, a specific people group.
Yeah, those are the ones who really dedicate their lives to cross-cultural ministry, often going to like remote areas, sometimes dangerous places.
Yeah, that's what we typically think of when we hear the word missionary, right? Someone going overseas to a far-off land.
Right. But what I really appreciate about this speech is how it presents these three categories. It doesn't like elevate one type above the other. So they're all valuable. They all play a crucial role in this global effort.
Yeah, I love that. It's so inclusive. It shows that missions isn't just for, like, a select few who are called to some faraway place. It's something we can all be a part of, no matter who we are or where we are in life.
And, it reminds us that we don't have to wait for some big dramatic call to get involved. There are opportunities all around us every day.
It really makes you think, what kind of missionary am I? Or, what kind of missionary could I be?
That's a great question. And it kind of leads us to another really fascinating aspect of the speech, where the speaker starts talking about power in a whole new way.
Yeah, the speaker mentioned Korea's spiritual power, but also its technology, its economy, its culture, and how all of those things could be used to spread the gospel. What really stood out to you about that section?
Well, it made me realize that missionary work isn't limited to like traditional methods. God can work through so many different avenues: technology, innovation, cultural exchange, even economic development.
Right. It was so cool how the speaker connected all those things back to the Holy Spirit. Like, they could all be ways for God to work in the world. Do you think other countries, with different strength could do something similar?
Oh, absolutely. Every nation has its own unique gifts and resources. The key is to figure out what those strengths are and then discern how to use them for God's kingdom. I think Korea is a great example because it encourages us to think outside the box, be creative, be resourceful.
I love that. They're using technology to develop new ways to reach people. They're using their economic resources to support missionaries and humanitarian efforts. And they're using their culture, like their music and their movies, to build connections with people all over the world. Pretty inspiring, right?
It really is. And it reminds me of that passage in Romans where Paul says, I am a debtor to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. He felt this deep responsibility to share the gospel with everyone, no matter who they were or what their background was.
Yeah, and I think the speaker's saying something similar, right? That we have this obligation, this debt of love, to share this message of hope with the entire world and to use every resource we have to do it.
It's like we're all called to be ambassadors for Christ, and we can each use our unique skills and talents and resources to represent God's kingdom in a way that makes sense to the people around us.
It's about finding those points of connection, those shared interests, those things that can lead to genuine conversations that can open people's hearts to the gospel.
Exactly, and that's where cultural sensitivity comes in. It's not about forcing our beliefs on others. It's about engaging with them, listening to them, learning from them, and then finding ways to communicate the love of Christ in a way that resonates with them.
Yeah, it's about building bridges, not walls. And the example of those Korean missionaries in India, learning the language, respecting the customs, really shows how to do that well.
Right. It's not about conquering or converting. It's about relationships, about respect, and it's about caring for people, even if they never accept our message.
At the end of the day, it all comes down to love, doesn't it? It's the love of Christ that compels us to share this good news. And it's that same love that should guide everything we do.
That's beautifully said. And I think that's what the speaker was getting at, even if it was subtle. Love has to be the driving force behind everything we do. It's not about checking boxes or meeting quotas. It's about sharing this message that has transformed our own hearts.
And that brings us to the very end of the speech, where the speaker brings up the Apostle Paul. What did you make of that section?
It's really interesting that they focused on Romans 1:14-16, where Paul talks about being eager to preach the gospel, how he's not ashamed of it, how he feels this deep sense of responsibility to share it.
Yeah, I remember that passage. He says he's not ashamed because the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes.
Right. And I think the speaker was drawing a parallel between Paul's commitment and the challenges that missionaries face today, especially in places where Christianity isn't the majority religion.
So it's like a call to perseverance, To stay strong in our faith even when things are tough.
Exactly. And to never be ashamed of sharing the gospel.
And what about Paul's motivation? I thought that was really interesting, too. He felt like he was in debt to God for all that God had done for him.
Yeah, it wasn't about like personal ambition or anything like that. It was pure gratitude. He had experienced God's grace,
Yeah.
and he wanted everyone else to experience it too.
So it's not about duty or obligation. It's about sharing something so powerful and life-changing that you can't help but tell other people about it.
Exactly. It's that contagious joy, that overflowing love that just has to be shared.
And that's a great note to end on, don't you think? I mean, at its core, missionary work is an act of love. It's fueled by gratitude and this deep desire to see other people experience the fullness of life that comes from knowing Christ.
Absolutely. So it leaves us with this question. How can we, like Paul, let that love overflow into our lives and our interactions with others? How can we share this good news with the world?
And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into this incredible speech. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you. You know, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is how the speech made it clear that spreading the gospel isn't just for, like, a select few super Christians. It's for everyone. I loved how they talked about those different types of missionaries: stayed, scattered, and sent. It really expanded my whole view of missions.
It really does change how you think about it, doesn't it? It's
Yeah.
like no matter where you are or what your life looks like, you can still be a part of this mission.
Yeah, and that whole emphasis on the Holy Spirit, too. I mean, that was powerful. It's so easy to forget that we're not doing this on our own. We've got God's power working through us.
Definitely. And that ties in so well with that whole discussion about Korea's different forms of power, right? Spiritual power, obviously, but also technology, economics, culture. All these things can be channels for the Holy Spirit.
It's like we need to wake up and see all the resources we have, even the ones that don't seem spiritual on the surface. It makes me think, okay, what are my talents? What can I offer? How can I use those things to make a difference, even if it's just in my own little corner of the world?
Exactly. That's what's so great about this message. It's like an invitation to look at your whole life and see how everything, your passions, your job, your hobbies, can be used for God's purposes.
Another thing that really stuck with me was that idea of cultural sensitivity. It's not about forcing our beliefs on people. It's about respecting where they come from and finding ways to genuinely share our faith in a way that makes sense to them.
Absolutely. I think that's what makes the example of those Korean missionaries in India so inspiring, right? They're really putting that into practice, learning the language, integrating into the community, finding creative ways to connect with people within that culture.
It's such a good example of how to do mission work well. It's bold, but it's also compassionate. They're unwavering in their commitment to sharing the gospel, but they also genuinely care about the people they're reaching.
It's a good reminder for all of us that effective mission work requires humility. We need to be willing to learn, to be sensitive to other cultures, and to treat every person with respect, whether they accept our message or not.
Because ultimately, it all boils down to love, right? It's the love of Christ that motivates us to do this.
Beautifully said. And I think that was the underlying message of this whole speech, even if it wasn't always explicitly stated. Love has to be our guide.
Speaking of love, that part where the speaker talked about the Apostle Paul, that really hit home for me. I mean, Paul was so dedicated to spreading the gospel. He was fearless, and he had this amazing sense of urgency.
Yeah, and the speaker really highlighted that passage in Romans where Paul says he's not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes.
It's such a powerful reminder that we shouldn't be ashamed either. We need to be bold and share our faith no matter what challenges we face.
And we need to remember why we're doing this. It's not out of obligation. It's because we've experienced something incredible and we want everyone else to experience it too.
So it's not about checking off a to-do list. It's about sharing something so powerful that we can't keep it to ourselves.
It's about letting that joy and that love overflow.
It's about changing the world one heart at a time. And I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up our deep dive.
It really is. This speech was a call to action. It challenged us to look at our lives, our talents, our resources, and ask ourselves, how can I be a part of God's story? How can I make a difference?
So to all of you listening out there, we encourage you to embrace the adventure of faith. Be open to what God might be calling you to do. Find your own unique way to contribute to this incredible story that's unfolding all around us.
You have a story to tell. You have a light to shine. You have the power to make a difference. Don't underestimate that.
The world is waiting to hear your story, so go out there and make it a good one. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating deep dive into a topic we hope you'll find interesting.